No, very few people even thought it would last this long. It's a year already, and I think even the Russian president thought it would be over just in a few days or weeks. And when the troops invaded Ukraine. But I think that all parties concerned should be taken into consideration in negotiating a settlement, and that is the security of the countries in the region, as well as the concern about NATO and the expansion of NATO post-Soviet Union's disintegration, the expansion of NATO toward Russia's borders. All of that has to be considered in order to negotiate this. And I do believe that we should absolutely require the honoring of the UN Charter, which is the sovereignty of nations, the territorial integrity. And China has put forth a plan that includes these. That's a good plan that should be looked at, as President Zelensky himself said. And therefore, we have to come to some sort of agreement on both sides. And the United Nations and the United States and other leading countries have to be involved in a much more comprehensive way in accepting the need to come together to stop this, because this war can get completely out of hand. It's already caused the death of thousands of people in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides, and nuclear rattling, saber rattling, and threats that could actually end up in an unintended nuclear war. That's something that has to be really put on the table as the top priority, to end this conflict as soon as possible and de-escalate, especially with the nuclear threat and those kinds of saber rattling going on.
And just on the UK, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak seems to be backing Zelensky's support for a China engagement. But there are those who say, Western officials, that China's peace plan is tainted by its support for Russia. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that the Chinese plan is something that should be looked at very carefully, and it's encouraging to see that the Prime Minister Sunak and others are looking at it carefully, including President Zelensky. And what China is proposing is to, first of all, outright come out and ban any possibility of nuclear weapons being used at all. That's the top priority. And then also territorial integrity and negotiated settlement. All of these principles are key, and to flesh out the details, I think these parties have to get together with China and talk about the details, as President Zelensky wants to do. So I do believe that this is the approach, the British approach under Prime Minister Sunak, as well as the others who are willing to look at the Chinese proposals, are the best way to go. I believe that Western powers have to comply along with Russia in seeing that this is a major threat, not just to world peace, which is the worst thing that's being violated, but also the threat to world economic development, where grains are in shortage and there's starvation in parts of the world, especially the global south. And this cannot be tolerated, that millions of people are not having enough food to eat because of this war, and fertilizers have been cut off, other commodities that many people, millions in the world, rely upon. It's not just affecting Ukraine and Russia, although they have the most effect, especially Ukraine, but the entire world. So I would say we have to take this plan very seriously, and Prime Minister Sunak's position is should be well taken.
And I want to latch on to this train of thought, because what we saw play out at the UN Security Council and the General Assembly has been this matter of principle, has been this matter of perspective, particularly on countries who said they want to take a non-aligned stand, South Africa being one of those. We spoke about the House of Representatives considering possible action against South Africa, and some even saying that ties with Pretoria ought to be reconsidered. So when we look at China's proposals, it should be against this conversation. But you have at the moment the statement by Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, saying China has already taken sides in a conflict that ought to be resolved. Can we be talking against those linear terms?
Well, starting with what you mentioned with South Africa's position on the non-aligned movement, it was a very strong movement that founded way back in the 50s by India, Egypt, and Yugoslavia, and spreading to dozens of countries that are part of the non-aligned movement. They have got a point that peace and disarmament and coming together in negotiated settlements in war to prevent war, to reduce or eliminate the war that's going on, has to be the top priority. Now, I don't think the United States should in any way punish South Africa. And in fact, Senator Graham actually said that they won't be punishing South Africa regarding the program with HIV, which the United States has been helping with. That should continue, he said. And even though some people in the U.S. may not be pleased with the position that South Africa may be taking on the neutrality on this issue, they should not retaliate in a punitive way on a humanitarian basis. So I believe that cool and calm heads have to prevail. We are in a very critical situation here. This war can spiral completely out of control and engulf the entire globe, which no one wants. No one wants that.
So how would you characterize what's happened in the past year? The Ukrainian President Zelensky reflecting on this anniversary, speaking about the courage of Ukrainian soldiers and its people. And I'm just wondering, we were speaking about the balance of power earlier on, the losses and the gains on the war front. Is there a win ever in war? And just what Zelensky says in terms of how he understands the war, that Russia's attempted to subjugate the Ukraine. And we know that Russia has actually defied this narrative, saying it was in turn put in this position. Please share your thoughts on this.
Well, there are different opposing interpretations of what has happened, and they both have to be considered in order to end this conflict. And I do believe that if calm heads would prevail, and we look at the historical facts and the security concerns of this, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and the security concerns of the East and the West, that should have been attained right away. And the promises or commitments kept about NATO should have been essentially honored. And I believe that the Russian demand that Ukraine do not join NATO, that was the key to the whole issue of not allowing the war to begin. Now, in no way am I condoning what President Putin did in invading Ukraine at that time a year ago, but I would just suggest that if you have to just negotiate a settlement, that all sides' concerns have to be taken into effect, and to have calm and cool heads prevail, while preserving the key central components, as your previous guest said, of the United Nations Charter, which will keep the world much safer, actually. If you recognize territorial integrity, the independence of all peoples and human rights, and also economic development. All that has to be brought in together. And I'm sure there's an economic component as well. Ukraine wanted to join, many people in Ukraine want to join the EU because they think they'd have better economic development prospects there. But that could have been worked out in a balanced way. Initially, Russia was not against Ukraine joining the EU. It was just against Ukraine joining NATO. So all of these facts have to be considered in negotiating a settlement right now.
What has happened in the last 365 days, particularly in terms of multilateralism, the world order? And I say this against a backdrop on Russia's recent stance or statements on the nuclear treaty. Some saying it's raised fears of a new nuclear arms race. Is this the world that we are going to in the next 365 days?
And that's why I'm really raising this issue of bringing this conflict to an end as rapidly and fairly as possible, because what has happened recently with Russia declaring that they're going to suspend their involvement in the New START treaty, which will allow them to go ahead and build and start another continuing arms race with long-range nuclear warheads and missiles. This is not good for any part of the world for this to happen, because then the United States will reciprocate. And right now, Russia and the U.S. each have over 1,500 warheads. And that, at least one side has a slightly over, and the other one's at 1,500 warheads, which is in the New START treaty. And this treaty should actually be strengthened, and we should actually go back to some of the treaties that the United States withdrew from, like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and the other treaties that were negotiated under previous governments. President Gorbachev and Reagan negotiated the INF Treaty. We cannot be withdrawing from these treaties. When I say we, I'm talking about United States leadership that is withdrawn from some of these treaties earlier, previous presidents. We need to get back to the negotiating table, especially with nuclear armed states, and bring in multilateral nuclear control, arms control, once again, with a view toward moving toward disarmament, because every weapon invented by humankind has been used so far. It would be very tragic. We probably will not recover from that if nuclear weapons get used at all in the future. We know the atomic bombs were dropped before in the past. They were far damaging to the Japanese people, but those atomic bombs were much smaller than what a nuclear weapon would be. Today's nuclear weapons going off would be horrendous. And it won't stop with just one necessarily. So we have got to look at that Armageddon scenario and see if we can avoid that. And it takes school heads and comm heads and intellects to prevail, and people with goodwill to prevail right now. This is a critical moment in our history right now.